Hi, everyone. It's nice to see this room filling up. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. While we're waiting, I'd love to get a chance to see, who we have in the room. If you guys are comfortable, if you want to just introduce yourselves in the chat, maybe just your name. I don't know, if you're part of an organization, what organization you're coming from. That could be fun. Some more people coming in. To everyone that just got admitted, we're introducing ourselves in the chat really quickly. If you just want to say your name. Yes, we are sending the recording out to everybody. You'll just get it if you got a ticket, so don't worry about it. Maybe I can start my little spiel as people. Oh, cool, someone from Germany. Okay. Yeah, we might just give a couple minutes for people to trickle in, but please continue introducing yourselves. Okay, great. Okay, cool. I think I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Tiggy. I'm the food campaigner here, the food production campaigner here at Feedback Global. It's so lovely to see people in this room for this talk. As you're introducing yourself in the chat, maybe I can tell you a bit about me and the aims for this event and sort of a background before we get into the main presentation. So I'm Tiggy, like I said, I recently started at Feedback Global. Before I was working here, I was involved in a lot of defund the police and decarceral organizing in Connecticut in the USA. And after moving here, I started working at Feedback, and I work mainly across our fishery business campaigns, which is our campaign on industrial fish farming, and also on the big livestock campaign with Martin, my colleague, who you'll hear from soon. And the campaign goal for this campaign is pretty simple. We demand, we are asking really for that the financial sector stops financing industrial livestock completely. To put it briefly, the meat and dairy industries are a climate issue. They're also a social justice issue and a health issue. When you look at industrial livestock and companies like Cargill and JBS, these are not companies that care at all about our health and nourishment as consumers, despite selling us our food. These are not companies that care about the welfare of their employees, despite reaping mountains and mountains of profits year after year off of their backs. And these are certainly not companies that show even a lick of respect or concern for the health of our environment, the earth and her resources, despite their entire business model depending on the extraction of land. These are operations that prioritize a quick buck over the health of our planet and her people, that exploit prison labor, chase indigenous communities from their ancestral land, pollute our soils, and set our forests ablaze. Vandana Shiva, Indian physicist and activist and author of Soil, Not Oil, Environmental Justice in the Age of Climate Crisis, puts it very succinctly: nature shrinks as capital grows. The growth of the market cannot solve the very crisis it creates. That being said, welcome to tonight's talk, titled Butchering the Planet, Why We Need to Defund Industrial Livestock. Shortly, you will hear a presentation from my colleague Martin, who will expand on some of these sentiments and Feedback's work in the area. Namely, Martin will be talking about why meat is a climate issue, why industrial livestock companies suck on so many fronts, and really our case for divestment. After the presentation, we will launch into an open discussion where you have the chance to ask Martin some questions, but really we also hope to start an open conversation amongst everybody here in this room. We are especially looking forward to hearing from some of the grassroots participants here, working in activism around this or the defund fossil fuel space, aware that this is a very adjacent issue that we're working on, thinking about the thoughts that you have, challenges you might face, and we could learn from each other. So before I hand over to Martin, just some general housekeeping. This presentation, as you noticed, will be recorded, but we're not going to record the chat portion. So you feel more free to speak in the chat. The recording will be emailed out to everybody on the list, and I believe we will be posting a version of this on our YouTube channel as well. And just note that this is a public Zoom link. Keep that in mind if you were planning on sharing, say, any more sensitive information or strategy, that we didn't really regulate who has access to this link. And yeah, we really want to encourage feedback and an active chat, as some of you have been engaging with already. I think some of the worst parts of a Zoom meeting, as lovely as it is in other ways, is just like it feels like you're talking to your screen all the time. So it's lovely to know that there's people on the other end of this. So feel free to react, share questions, comments, reactions in the chat. But please, if you have any questions for Martin as he presents, keep them to the end of the presentation, and then you can ask your questions. Okay, I'll just hand over to you then, Martin.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tiggy, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Yeah, I'm going to kick off, as Tiggy says, with a quick presentation. So we basically love to share some of the research that Feedback have been doing over the last few years in this issue. But why we're really here today is to talk with you and hear your questions, but also like hear some of your appetite for getting involved in this issue. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. Right, great. So without further ado, I'll share my screen. Great, can you see that okay? That's great. Okay, fantastic. Well, I'll just kick off by explaining, yeah, so welcome. We're from a group called Feedback, a sort of environmental NGO that focuses on pushing for a sustainable food system. And today we'll be talking about why we need to divest, defund, and regulate industrial livestock. So I'm going to start off by just saying that actually a lot of the stuff we'll be talking about today is based on some of these reports that we've done over the years, including its Big Livestock versus the Planet. Do have a look at these on our website, but we'll be going through a few of the key findings today. So why regulate big livestock? So one of the headline reasons is for climate change. Basically, if current trends continue, by 2030, the global meat and dairy industry alone will be using up almost half of the emissions budget we can emit to stay safely within 1.5 degrees of global heating. So to just explain this, we have a certain amount of emissions that we can safely put into the atmosphere by 2030, and before we push over the threshold of climate crisis. And this is saying that even if all other emissions from every other sector end, so all fossil fuel emissions, half of that budget would be taken up just by livestock alone. And that leaves only half the rest for everything else. And clearly this will make staying within environmental limits impossible. And as a result, Professor Hans Putner, scientist and co-chair of the IPCC, recently said, without reducing and cutting down on meat consumption and the associated high-intensity agriculture systems, we will not be able to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. That is very clear. So why is it so vital that we reduce meat and dairy to stay within environmental limits? Well, here is it's a complicated issue, but here is a sort of emissions chart that shows the sort of range of emissions of different foods, and you can see here that there's a big variation. Like meat can be produced in lower emissions ways, but despite that, even the lowest impact meat and dairy tends to be higher impacts than most sorts of plant-based alternatives. And so really this is the crux of why there are limits to how much you can decarbonize meat and dairy without dietary shifts to less meat at the very least. And a bit of global context here. So the global meat production that we have currently is not normal. So historically, it's not normal. So global meat production has more than quadrupled since the 1961. But also geographically, so for instance, the UK has about double the global average meat consumption. Um, so this is historically and geographically abnormal. We're producing and consuming way more meat than we have done throughout the entire of human history. Um, and in the UK, taking it through to the UK, so every scenario that the Committee on Climate Change models for the UK meeting our climate targets includes a shift to a lower meat consumption, and they call it particularly important. And most of their scenarios included a 50% reduction in meat and dairy, and also a recent government commissioned document, the National Food Strategy. This was commissioned by the UK government from their food czar, their words, not mine, Henry Dimbleby, and he concluded that the UK needed to reduce meat and dairy consumption by about 30% by 2030. We actually think that we and many other NGOs, about 60 other NGOs, are part of a coalition called Eating Better that is pushing for a 50% reduction by 2030. And if we zoom out for a second, we can see that on land as well, not just emissions, meat and dairy have a huge impact. So globally, meat, dairy, egg, and aquaculture production uses 83% of the world's farmland, including pasture and cropland, despite providing only 37% of the world's protein and 18% of the world's calories. So on really, land is one of the biggest impacts of meat on emissions, biodiversity, and so on. And as an example, in the high meat consuming countries of the EU, livestock causes about 81 to 86% of the EU's total agricultural emissions. It also uses about 71% of agricultural land, including 63% of cropland. So this is something that's not often understood, is that it's not just pasture and so on that's used to produce livestock in the EU, but actually over half of the cropland that we could be using to grow food for human consumption, over half of that is used to produce animal feed like maize and so on. In addition to that, it uses substantial land overseas, and it also receives 69 to 79% of the EU CAP subsidy payments that go to farmers. So most EU subsidies in agriculture are going towards livestock rather than food direct for human consumption. And this is really important for global justice. So when we look at emissions globally, we see that actually a tiny minority of the world's population cause the majority of the emissions. So here, this is a graph from Oxfam, and they show that the richest 10% of the world's population are responsible for about 50% of emissions. You can see here at the bottom, often there's sort of blames of global emissions on overpopulation and so on, but actually you can see here the global majority with the lowest income, 50%, only responsible for about 10% of global emissions. So we don't have a population problem, we have a rich minority problem who are causing the majority of emissions. And you can see this shown in a different way here, that the lowest income 50% are shown in dark green at the bottom, their proportion of emissions over time. And at the top there, you can see here, it's split out the richest 1% there in the black, actually cause quite a huge, staggering proportion of world emissions. And why do I bring this up in the context of this debate? Well, um, diets, which we think of as having a fairly even impact, we all eat, everyone globally on the planet eats. So you might assume, well, everyone has a kind of equal impact there. But even in diets, we have this unequal impact. So the average Indian, Nigerian, or Thai citizen requires about a quarter of the land per person compared with the diet of the average Brit. And you can see this in the huge land footprint of UK diets. 85% of the UK's total agricultural footprint is associated with meat and dairy production. So if the whole world adopted the UK's averaged high meat diets, global land use would have to nearly double. And this would be game over for the world's ecosystems, for our emissions targets. You can say goodbye to any attempt to reduce deforestation. This would literally be a doubling of global agricultural area. For the US, it's even more extreme because they eat even more meat, so agricultural land use would have to triple. Whereas in comparison, if the world adopted the average diet eaten in India, we need to halve global agricultural land use. So you can see that this is a kind of dietary colonialism where the high land use diets of richer countries are taking an unfair share both of emissions and land use globally. And of course, as we know, sadly, the effects of climate change and land use change are disproportionately felt in the global south. So this is a global justice issue as well. And you can see here, this is another of these maps, the staggering amount of land in the US that's used for pasture and to grow livestock feed. So there's a few other impacts of this destructive industry that affect the environment, but also people at the same time. So, for instance, one of the main sources of emissions from livestock is the sheer volume of manure and slurries that are produced. And you can see here, this is a kind of manure lagoon that's used in factory farming. Basically, all of the manure is washed out of the factory farms and ends up here where it belches out emissions. And this has huge health impacts on people as well as the environment. So, for instance, it might surprise you to hear we hear a lot about air pollution from cars and from fossil fuels, which quite rightly, but actually now we've got to a stage where the ammonia from farms in the UK causes 60% of UK particular air pollution. And this comes from mainly manure, but also from kind of nitrogen fertilizer, a lot of which is used to grow animal feeds. And the effects of this are felt unevenly. So, for instance, in North Carolina, factory farms are often located closer to Black and Latinx communities who feel disproportionately their health impacts of these massive manure lagoons polluting their local air and rivers. Also, one of the terrible impacts of industrial livestock is in meat packing plants. So meat packing is a very dangerous and low paid and precarious sector. It relies a lot on migrant labor, often with precarious and exploitative low pay contracts, and huge injury rates. So this is absolutely staggering. In the US, it was found that a worker in the US meat and poultry industry lost a body part or was sent to hospital or inpatient treatment about every other day between 2015 and 2018, which is higher injury rates than would occur in sawmills, industrial building construction, and oil and gas drilling. So this is an exploitative industry from the perspective of workers too. As we talked about earlier, the huge land use impact of meat and dairy also means that it's one of the leading causes of deforestation. So about 41% of global tropical deforestation is driven by pastures for cattle, and a further 7% is caused by soy production, which is almost entirely used for animal feed. And this means that livestock sector is the biggest single driver of tropical deforestation globally. And that goes, as many of you may know, alongside exploitation of indigenous peoples who are often subjected to land grabs and violent eviction from the forests they protect. Lastly, in terms of sort of health, very relevant, we're all just recovering from the global trauma that was the COVID pandemic. Really, factory farming is one of the biggest global drivers of pandemic risks. So scientists recently warned that factory farming raises future pandemic risks, and saying that COVID-19 could be like a dress rehearsal. And part of the reason for this is that the huge antibiotics use on farms, so about 66% of all antibiotics globally are used on animals, making them huge reservoirs of potential disease, antibiotics resistant, meaning that we have a higher risk that antibiotics that we rely on for our health will stop working. But also just having that many animals crammed into often unsanitary conditions together in one place means that there's a higher chance of disease spreading between them. And finally, deforestation actually encroaching into wild habitats is also a leading cause of pandemic risk, as the interactions between wild animals and human population and farmed animal populations are caused through this. And of course, you know, the as well the obvious impact on animal welfare in factory farms is terrible, which goes alongside all of this. So how are we defining industrial livestock here? We define industrial livestock to mean intensive mass-produced livestock that's unsustainably supplying mainly rich countries over consumption of meat. And I want you here to think about like massive feedlots of the type cattle feedlots of the kind shown here, and huge factory farming, but also some large scale pasture where that's done at an unsustainable scale. And we know that within this, like the big players in this industry take up a huge proportion of meat and dairy production. So, for instance, the 10 largest meat and dairy companies in each sector account for a good chunk, somewhere between sort of 20 and 30% often in each of these sectors. So there's a handful of companies often responsible for a big chunk of global meat and dairy production. So let's zoom in on an example. JBS is the world's largest meat producer. They're based in South America. They emitted an estimated 280 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2016, and they have capacity to slaughter more than 75,000 cows, 115,000 pigs, and 14 million birds per day. They've been given they've been frequently linked to deforestation, and they have frequently been embroiled in corruption allegations in Brazil. So this is just an example of one of the types of companies that we're talking about when we talk about big livestock. So why do we want to defund big livestock? We might have seen that the fossil fuel divestment movement has grown massively over the past decade. And basically, the fossil fuel divestment movement is calling on financial institutions like banks to cut off the money supply to fossil fuel projects, to stop lending loans, to stop investing in shares. And there have been some huge successes in this. So about 1,485 institutions globally, representing 39 trillion in assets, committed to going fossil free. And also in the UK, over half of universities and several local government pension schemes have pulled their money out of fossil fuels. And we need to do the same for the meat industry, because after all, these giant meat corporations, they rely for their expansion and continuation on the money that they get from banks and other institutional investors. So we've been, alongside other campaigners, been kind of trying to kickstart this movement. It's quite a young movement for industrial meat and dairy. But it's a really exciting field. We think that engagement with these companies won't work. So the reason we think this is their core business is a polluting industry. So for most of the companies that we're talking about here, over 50% of their revenue comes from industrially produced mass production of meat and dairy. And that means that they have very little incentive to reduce that meat production. And to be clear here, when we say we divest from meat and dairy, we're not necessarily, you don't have to be a vegan to believe in this, although, you know, that's also a valid argument. But even within a context where we're shifting towards downscaling meat production to within the planetary boundaries, we need to divest from these companies, because we need to move to a world of less meat, whereas these companies are hardwired to expand and drive more production of meat, and they're the biggest producers globally. So the existence of these companies are fundamentally at odds with the future of lower meat production that we need to stay within planetary boundaries. Also, a lot of these companies are closely held, so it's very difficult which means they're owned by a minority, a handful of individuals, and so shareholders, even collectively, have often limited influence on them. So we think it's better to save engagement with retailers and caterers who, you know, their core business isn't livestock, and they can shift procurement practices. We think, on the flip side, we think so funding big livestock is really effective, and this is because it really can hurt the bottom line of these companies. So it can deflate their share prices, it can increase their costs of capital. So, for instance, it can cost them more to raise money to expand through loans. But even more importantly, it erodes the legitimacy of these companies. It provides reputational damage, and that can help pave the way further down the line for these companies to be regulated by governments as well. I'll skip over this a little bit because I'm aware of time, but I also find financially, these are risky investments for the investors themselves, so it's well worth making those arguments. So we're gonna we'd really like in a moment to talk about you know, the appetite out there for getting more involved in activism on these topics. I wanted to just give you a few examples of inspiring things, that some of which we've done directly, but often that have been done by other groups as well in this field. So for instance, we've been working coalition with a bunch of other NGOs on the Stop Financing Factory Farming Coalition, that is trying to get big multinational development banks, so like the World Bank, to stop funding industrial livestock. And we've actually already had some successes with this. We managed to get a loan to one of the biggest Brazilian beef companies in the world, dropped by the development bank IDB. It was £200 million in financing that was cut off successfully after we and hundreds of other NGOs wrote to protest that. We've worked in collaboration with World Animal Protection to create this tool, which enables you to look up your local authority's pension fund. So this is like the pension fund for council workers, but also people in schools and hospitals often. Their pension funds are managed and invested in different things. So if you put in your postcode here, you can find out, for instance, how much your pension fund is invested in livestock or animal feed companies. We've created a great tool that enables you to easily email your local councillors to call on them to divest the pension fund from these companies. Here's a list of some of the biggest investors in the UK. Again, we'll share this afterwards. But then coming to the kind of some of the biggest players, a couple of years ago, we did a report called Butchering the Planet, where we looked at the biggest financiers globally of industrial livestock. And we found that between 2015 and 2020, global meat and dairy companies received nearly 500 billion in backing from thousands of investment firms. And here's some of the worst culprits. So fossil fuel divestment campaigners will not be surprised to see some of the worst culprits for fossil fuels in here as well. Barclays and the HSBC in the UK are both high up, alongside BNP Paribas and JP Morgan Chase. This is creditors, so like lending loans, for instance, to these companies. The biggest investors, so like shareholders, bondholders, will be very familiar to fossil fuel campaigners: BlackRock, Capital Group, Vanguard, all of these huge, the big three sort of US-based investors. So there's loads of incredible work that's beginning to happen to challenge this. So as an example, Extinction Rebellion in Denmark recently did an action where one of their calls on the government was to end the loans to industrial livestock companies. There were protests in Brooklyn, again trying to call for animal agriculture linked to deforestation finance to be pulled. Forest and Finance did a great action where they collaborated with indigenous leaders to call on the Bank of Montreal to drop its links with companies involved in Amazon deforestation. And also there's lots of amazing work that's being done on engaging with AGMs. So we saw a lot of incredible presence from groups like XR and Money Rebellion at Barclays and HSBC AGMs over the past year. We actually attended Barclays AGM last year and asked some challenging questions about industrial livestock, but there's lots of potential for kind of shareholder activism and disrupting AGMs. I always love these. So also there's been some subvertising done on this topic. So this is a fake Barclays ad that was put up on a billboard in South London, criticising their financing of JBS, the world's biggest meat company. And you might have also seen this, which is about Barclays support for deforestation links companies, which it's great to engage with that via humour. So lastly, like one of the ways that the really positive, there's been some really positive wins from meat and dairy campaigning. As I say, part of the ultimate aim is to delegitimize and cause reputational damage for these companies. So we've seen some great wins from some governments around the world planning to cut meat consumption. So there's been like wins in hospital and school catering to try and reduce the amount of meat and dairy served. And some countries like the Netherlands are even have even adopted strict targets to reduce livestock numbers by 30% or banning meat advertising in public in the Dutch city of Haarlem. So there's encouraging signs. We're less far along than we are for fossil fuels, but this is an area of increasing momentum that's only going to see more in the coming years. And also we've seen some financial institutions like pretty substantial size have begun to pull their money out of industrial livestock. So just pick this example of De Volksbank, which is the fourth largest banking group in the Netherlands, managing 37 billion, has a policy of avoiding investments in livestock farming because of links to food security, climate change, biodiversity, and human rights. So there are beginning to be signs that this is a winnable battle, yeah, we hope to make that more so over the coming years. So thanks very much. Sorry for going over time a little bit, but really exciting. Really excited to hear your questions and get the discussion going. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. Before we move into our Q&A/discussion portion, I'll just say to everybody that's going to be tuning in afterwards, it won't be recorded, but if you feel inspired, outraged, want to act, want to collaborate, please hit us up.